Welcome back. You're watching Global Eye. Let's shift focus to the biggest sporting event of the year, the Olympics. With over 10,000 athletes, nearly 9 million tickets sold and billions of viewers across the world. The Olympics is an expensive affair for the host country. And this time, it's France. The Paris Olympics is estimated to cost nearly $9 billion. But surprisingly, this is only 60% of the budget of the Tokyo Olympics. The Summer Games are almost entirely funded by the host country. To take a deep dive into the math and challenges of the rising cost of Olympics, we're joined by economist Andrew Zimbalist. Professor Zimbalist, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Let me begin by asking you, at $9 or $10 billion, is hosting an event of this magnitude, though prestigious, does this create permanent economic benefits for a country?
There's been a tremendous amount of economic scholarship on this question over the last 30 years, and the results are almost universally that it does not promote economic development in the country, and more often than not, it creates fiscal losses. Keep in mind as well that the numbers that are often used, such as the $9 billion for the Paris Olympics, are not a complete tally of all of the costs that are involved. So there are costs, for instance, in cleaning up the Seine River. There are costs in expanding the metro out to the Saint-Denis area of Paris. And there are other costs that are not included there. You had a figure up of $13.7 billion for Tokyo. That was the official Olympic budget. It was about operations of the Games for 17 days. It did not include massive investments in infrastructure and probably total costs of around $30 billion. So what's quite typical for hosts of the Summer Games is that they have total costs that are 15, 20, 30, even higher, $1 billion. And they have revenues coming in from ticket sales, 20% of the international television revenue, a share of the international sponsorship revenue. All those revenues altogether come to about $5 billion. Paris is experiencing lower hotel capacity demand right now because normal tourists, Olympic tourists come, but normal tourists want to stay away because they're concerned about congestion, they're concerned about higher prices, they're concerned about the possibility of security incidents. And indeed, last night, there were security incidents affecting the railroads. So it's not a very positive economic proposition. And the notion that's often put out there is that it puts your city on the world map. How foolish is that? Paris doesn't have to worry about being on the world map. And Los Angeles, which we'll host in 2028, also does not have to worry about being on the world map. So the promises of long-term development are pretty much illusory. They have not been demonstrated econometrically or empirically.
Right.
It's something that I think a city has to try its best to break even fiscally. And even that is a major challenge.
Professor Zimbalist, I'd also like to ask you, you spoke about revenues from broadcast, revenues from ticket sales. Who actually gains the most out of the Olympics in terms of the largest chunk of revenues? Who does it really go to?
Well, the IOC gets the largest chunk of revenues. They keep about 80% of the international television revenues. They keep a majority of the sponsorship revenues. But, you know, look, the IOC is a nonprofit organization. They have executives who don't receive a salary, such as Thomas Bach. He does, however, get his living expenses paid for, and he lives quite luxuriously. But the vast majority of the revenues that the IOC gets are redistributed to international sport federations and national Olympic committees. So it's a nonprofit organization. There's nobody who owns the IOC or the Olympics who comes home with a profit or dividends at the end of the day. I think the real beneficiaries, by the way, are the local construction companies, the development companies that get billions of dollars of contracts as a result of the hosting exercise.
Okay. I'd also like to ask you about developing countries pitching to host the Olympics. India, for example, wants to host the Olympics and has been aspiration for 2036. What are some of the things that a country like India should keep in mind?
Well, the IOC decided at the beginning of this century that they wanted to distribute the hosting of the games to some of the developing countries. And so they started looking at some of the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And the experience that Rio had, Brazil had, that Beijing has had, that Russia and Sochi has had, are very negative experiences, because the less developed a country is or less developed a city is, the more it has to invest in sports infrastructure, in sports facilities, the more it has to invest in transportation and telecommunications infrastructure, the more it has to invest in hospitality infrastructure. And the kinds of numbers I talked about a moment ago, where Paris or Tokyo might be investing $15 billion, $25 billion, $30 billion, those numbers are much larger for the developing countries. In Sochi, the numbers were between $51 and $65 billion to host the 2014 Winter Olympics. In Beijing, the numbers for 2008 were up around $45 billion. So I would say there has to be an additional degree of caution when developing nations and developing cities try to get involved in hosting the Olympic Games.
Right. And very finally, very briefly, sir, do you see the IOC making reforms, bringing down the cost of hosting the Olympics and making sure that there are some permanent benefits?
Well, the IOC is trying. They have to try, because there are fewer and fewer cities that are willing to host the Games. There used to be open bidding amongst the cities of the world, and the IOC would make a great fanfare about the bidding and the competition amongst the cities. But most recently, the IOC has changed its model. It doesn't have open bidding anymore. They do everything behind closed doors. And I think it's primarily because they don't want to be embarrassed by cities not participating in the competition. For the 2024 Games, where we're having them right now in Paris, there were 5 European cities at the beginning of the bidding that all dropped out at the end. They decided it was, they had plebiscites, or they had petition drives, and the citizens decided it was too expensive and too environmentally challenging to go ahead with it. So the IOC is making some efforts to make it less expensive and to make it more sustainable. But those efforts so far have been very incremental. They're making changes at the margins, but the fundamental patterns still remain.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Zimbalist, for joining us and giving us the economics of the Olympics and why there are really no permanent benefits, and there could be fiscal losses for countries as well. Thank you once again for being with us. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Global Eye. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.